and welcome to Washington Talk. This is Connie Kim. Following the Russia-North Korea summit, Russian President Vladimir Putin said North Korea wants security guarantees and suggested Russia might welcome a revival of the six-party denuclearization talks. On the issue of North Korea workers in Russia, President Putin said there are measures that could be taken to avoid international confrontation, indicating a possible easing of sanctions. Is North Korea trying to find a breakthrough in negotiations by cozying up with Russia?
гарантии безопасности Корейской Народно-Демократической Республики, то без международных гарантий здесь не обойтись.
오랜 친선의 역사 전통을 가지고 있는 두 나라 관계를 보다 더 공고하고
In the studio with me today is Ms. Olivia Enos, a policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Ms. Enos is an Asia specialist and focuses her research on human rights and national security. Also joining me today is Mr. Scott Snyder, director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Ms. Enos and Mr. Snyder, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. So I want to start up by getting your assessments on the Russia-North Korea summit. Do you think that the two sides got what they wanted?
I think the first thing that we have to recognize is that Russia and North Korea actually don't have that much interest in each other. And so in a way, the nature of the interaction was transactional. Both sides had particular things that they needed to get from each other. For Putin, essentially a meeting with Kim Jong-un gets him back in the game of being relevant to Northeast Asian security. And for Kim Jong-un, he, I think, was looking for some sanctions relief, but also he was trying to recover from the failure of the Hanoi summit, and he was trying to show the United States and actually China that he has alternatives to overdependence on either of them.
Do you agree with Mr. Scott Snyder?
I do. I really think that this was another stop on North Korea's charm offensive, because we have seen, North Korea shaking hands with the Singapore Prime Minister, meeting with the Vietnamese president, obviously the meetings with President Trump. All of this gives him a shored up image in the international community and makes him a really normal actor. And I think we have to be really wary of this, because North Korea is wanting to be able to come home with a deliverable, as Scott said, after the Hanoi summit. I mean, negotiations fell apart. He wasn't able to deliver the sanctions relief that many of the North Korean people anticipated would be there. And so I think he wanted to get commitments from Russia that, you know what, North Korea, we have your back. And I think that Kim Jong-un wants the same from China as well. And so I would not be surprised if we continue to see meetings among a lot of these rogue actors where they're trying to communicate that, even though they might have interest in denuclearization, at the end of the day, they really do have North Korea's back, and maybe not the best intentions to make sure that North Korea actually commits to that complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of its nuclear program.
I want to focus on the denuclearization aspect that President Putin mentioned in the press conference. He said that Russia, along with the U.S., wants complete denuclearization, but he emphasized international security guarantees for North Korea and brought up the idea of six-party denuclearization talks. How should we read into this?
Well, so what was really interesting, I think, about Putin's answer there is that he aligned himself and Russia with the objective of denuclearization. And so that's very important from our perspective. And actually, he prioritized denuclearization. But he also, on the issues of peace and security, I think lined up a little bit more with the North Korean side.
So do you think that President Putin was playing the heels in the U.S.-North Korea negotiations through his statement here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the U.S. has repeatedly issued security guarantees and promises to North Korea that it wasn't going to act in an adversarial manner. And so I think for Putin to say this, while it's good for him to be committing to denuclearization, I think for him to be requesting some sort of guarantees as a precondition seems a little bit two-faced, because the U.S. has already issued these security guarantees, has already, when President Trump left Hanoi, he said, the door is wide open for continued negotiations. And so I think that's the intention of the U.S. And so I think that hopefully North Korea won't read into that too much and continue to make asks when really, even since Singapore, we haven't seen tangible steps that North Korea is taking toward denuclearization.
Right. President Trump has been emphasizing that there is a bright economic future for North Korea once they denuclearize. And I want to go back to the point on six-party talks. How do you think that the U.S. is going to take this idea that Russia floated?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that President Putin didn't say that we should immediately go back to six-party talks.
Right.
I think that he did recognize that there are some things that need to occur before getting to that. But what he did say is that the six-party framework can be a useful means by which to implement some of the possible security guarantees that could come up. And I actually think that that is correct. But I think that the U.S. At present is really focused on the bilateral first. And maybe the U.S. might be willing to strengthen consultation among the six-party members as part of a framework if we get to the point of actually implementing regional security guarantees. But really the first priority remains getting a commitment to denuclearization from North Korea.
We'll have to see how the U.S. responds when they're emphasizing a top-down diplomacy at this moment. And I want to focus our attention to sanctions a little bit. The major focus of the summit was whether North Korea is going to get some sanctions relief. What kind of sanctions relief request do you think Chairman Kim has made to President Putin?
I mean, no doubt he's wanting to find ways to relieve that pressure mechanism. And I think if there was any clear message coming out of the Hanoi summit, it's that sanctions are working. That was North Korea's #1 request when he was leaving Hanoi. He said, we're really concerned about the impact that sanctions are having. And no doubt he wants those from Russia. But I think, one thing that was interesting is that we knew going into this meeting between Putin and Kim Jong-un that there wasn't going to be a formal statement, no formal declaration, and virtually no tangible deliverables coming out of this. And I think part of that is because Russia has always been in the background doing shady business with North Korea, engaging in those ship-to-ship transfers that they've actually been sanctioned by Treasury for, or employing North Korean forced laborers, which we know are a substantial revenue base for the Kim regime. And so I would anticipate all of those things sort of coming into fruition. And this is why I'm personally skeptical about a six-party talks mechanism in the formal sense, because we know that both Russia and China have been very irresponsible actors, and especially since Singapore have really taken their foot off the gas when it comes to putting pressure on North Korea. And so I would be concerned to return especially to a six-party talks mechanism, because even though those players certainly have interests at stake, I'm not sure that they would really advance us on the path toward denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. On your point of the North Korean workers in Russia, President Putin mentioned that there could be non-confrontational solutions on this matter. What do you think President Putin can come up with?
Well, it's hard to know exactly what he might come up with, and we can only imagine that most of those solutions probably involve skirting the letter of the law, or abiding by the letter of the law while skirting the spirit of the law. And so we can imagine, I think, all sorts of ways in which there could be informal arrangements between North Korea and Russia that could sustain this overseas labor, but in a different form from that which is identified in the UN Security Council resolutions. And so actually I think that what Putin did was to tell us, watch this space, especially if you're concerned about enforcement of overseas labor.
What is your take on the non-confrontational solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that a non-confrontational solution is on the table. They're required by the UN Security Council resolution to have all North Korean forced laborers out of their country by the end of 2019. And so that's very black and white. There's no in between there. And I think that Russia is going to need to comply. And if they're not going to comply, I think the U.S. needs to seriously consider the types of pressure options that we have, either using global Magnitsky sanctions to go after individuals and entities who continue to employ forced laborers, or using the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act to place individuals on the specially designated nationals list who continue to flout those international requirements.
And also on the trilateral economic projects between the two Koreas and Russia, President Putin said that the trilateral economic projects are unable to move forward because of South Korea's obligation to the U.S. as an ally. Is this a fair assessment made by President Putin?
I mean, I think that the reality is that this would be an unwise time for us to be moving forward with any sort of inter-Korean cooperation. I think it would also be unwise for Russia to be investing in substantial infrastructure in North Korea, because I think both actors would be found in violation of sanctions.
What is your take on
Well,
this?
I think that President Putin was actually fulfilling his role as troll-in-chief by pointing to the United States as an obstacle to this trilateral cooperation. We all know that it's the sanctions regime. We know that it's North Korea's non-compliance in terms of moving forward on denuclearization. And essentially, that sort of cooperation is the big prize that North Korea can get as part of the bright future that can be gained by actually fulfilling its denuclearization obligations. And so Putin just couldn't resist trying to make a little jab at the US-ROK alliance, and especially in a way that was designed to put the finger on South Korea a little bit.
And it's really on North Korea's court, I guess, because if they denuclearize, they will be able to push through all these trilateral economic projects. And so President Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping have met in the Belt and Road Forum. How do you think the two countries will cooperate on the issue on North Korea?
Well, I'm sure they're going to talk about it a little bit, and we know that they're aligned in terms of position on especially the peace and security part of the package, which is designed to put more pressure on the U.S. presence in East Asia. Really, the Chinese have been taking, I think, the leading role with regard to North Korea, and Russia has been more in the background, but I think that we see that their positions continue to be aligned in ways that pose some challenges to the U.S. on the peace and security side, while recognizing that we all have a shared interest in North Korea's denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. And I want to take a look at how North Korea's stance on these denuclearization talks with the U.S. will be going forward. KCNA reported that Kim Jong-un told President Putin that the security and the future of the Korean Peninsula is going to depend on the U.S. position. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, I think North Korea loves nothing more than to shift the blame to the United States. And so I think this was yet another example of them doing so. The U.S. was very clear after Hanoi that they are willing to continue these denuclearization talks.
Olivia is absolutely right that blame shifting is part of North Korea's MO when it comes to thinking about the United States, and especially after this post-Hanoi summit failure. But I also think that the Supreme People's Assembly speech that Kim Jong-un gave provides a bit of a roadmap in terms of other ways that North Korea is trying to maneuver in order to preserve the possibility of dialogue with the United States, while also restoring the perception that North Korea is coming at the issue from a position of strength, because that, of course, is the real challenge that Kim had, and meeting with Putin helped with that.
And April 27th marks the first-year anniversary of the first Inter-Korean Summit in the Moon administration. And President Moon said that he's going to work towards resuming the Mount Kumgang tours swiftly. How do you make of President Moon's statement when U.S. says no to these inter-Korean economic projects, especially Mount Kumgang and Kaesong?
I take it that it's just rhetorical. Moon can't resist dangling the carrot in front of Kim Jong-un, even though he knows that the U.S. will not let Kim Jong-un bite the carrot.
What did you make of that comment?
I worry when President Moon continues to offer opportunities for economic engagement with North Korea. I agree with Scott that we need to have carrots, there need to be incentives for North Korea to come to the negotiating table. But I think that the type of incentives that we're offering shouldn't be ones that violate the sanctions regime. Because I do think that there's a responsibility as allies. Some people characterize it as playing good cop, bad cop, but I think sometimes it creates confusion and makes it look like there's a substantial divergence in the priorities between the US and South Korea. And I think that at this point in time, especially since we walked away from the table in Hanoi, that it's really important that the two allies at least appear publicly to be on the same page, even if there are internal disagreements about how we proceed going forward.
Last but not least, before we move on, President Trump mentioned the Russia-North Korea summit, saying that we all need to get rid of nuclear weapons. What do you think the U.S.'s position on these negotiations with North Korea will be going forward?
I don't see any evidence that the U.S. position is really going to change, but I do believe that there perhaps will be some additional efforts to try to explore resumption of dialogue in order to see whether the North Korean position may have changed now that Kim Jong-un has kind of reestablished and recovered a narrative that makes it look like he's coming at this from a position of greater strength rather than weakness.
We'll definitely expect the U.S.'s emphasis on FFVD of North Korea.
Yes, that will continue.
We'll leave it here for now and move on to our next segment.
What we're really showing here through the programs, like on Monday, is how the women of North Korea created the free market system.
The international community has continued to condemn Pyongyang for its many human rights violations, but Pyongyang has argued that there have been many improvements to human rights in North Korea. This Sunday marks the start of the North Korea Freedom Week, a week devoted to promoting the freedom and human rights of North Koreans. So, Ms. Enos, you'll be actively involved in the North Korea Freedom Week. What do you think is going to be the main focus for this year?
Yeah, the main focus this year is going to be on the 정상회담 and the role that women play in the essentially emerging informal economy inside of North Korea. This has been an important market mechanism for promoting freedom for individuals, including access to information and outside goods. And so we'll hear from many of the North Korean women who were actually working in those markets and have since fled North Korea themselves.
Scott, I want to point upon the report that the North Koreans sent to the UN. It claims that it has made improvements in its human rights situations. What do you make of their claim?
So the progress is that North Korea actually responded and sent a report to the UN. But of course, most of what they wrote in the report were about these procedural adjustments that they're making in terms of their own legal framework. It has nothing to do with actual human rights conditions on the ground in North Korea. And it skirts the core issues that we focus on, the concentration camps, the conditions for people, the demands for political loyalty, and the punishment of family members for offenses that they did not necessarily, that they weren't involved with. And so there's a whole range of issues and specific challenges that the North Korean Human Rights Report did not address at all.
What are some of the things that North Korea lacked in that report?
For Kim Jong-un to say, oh, the conditions have fundamentally changed is a bold-faced lie. I mean, we know that there are populations inside of North Korea who are facing what the UN Commission of Inquiry report says are some of the world's worst human rights abuses in the contemporary world. And I believe that that's true. And to me, it's really shocking that not only the US, but a lot of actors in the international community are essentially seeing Holocaust-like events repeat themselves here in the modern day. And yet we don't have, as a component of our broader negotiation strategy, any elements that would get at addressing and alleviating the suffering of the most vulnerable people on earth. And so my hope is that these issues will be integrated into ongoing negotiations with North Korea.
And what I found ironic about this report is that they blamed international sanctions for not being able to deliver medicines for the disabled, for women and children. I mean, what do you take of North Korea's such claim?
Yeah, again, North Korea loves to shift blame and would love nothing more than for the international community to say that sanctions are the cause of humanitarian challenges inside of North Korea. But we know definitively that Kim Jong-un himself is responsible for the human rights abuses going on. The North Korean regime is the one who is responsible. And the reason we know this there are some simple figures out there. For example, in 2012, North Korea spent $1.3 billion just on its missile program. But then its request to the World Food Program on an annual basis is something like $53 million. It's clear that North Korea could be feeding its people, could be providing them with the medicine and the attention that they need, but they choose to divert those resources toward their nuclear program, or they spend hundreds of millions of dollars on luxury goods and the development of luxury facilities. And so I don't think we should let North Korea get away with that argument, because we know that they're responsible.
I want to briefly touch upon South Korea's stance on these human rights issues. The South Korean government has rejected North Korea Human Rights Organization's request for financial assistance to travel to Washington, D.C. for the Freedom Week. What does this tell us about the current administration's stance on North Korea's human rights situations?
Well, in South Korea, the politics around human rights is really strange, and it's backwards from what we're used to in the international community. And one way in which that manifests itself is that you have liberal, progressive administration that is actually unwilling to support human rights in North Korea, which human rights generally in the international community, the banner is usually carried by liberals and progressives. And so, this is a blind spot, I think, for progressive administrations in South Korea. The high point really, I think, in South Korea was the passage of a North Korea Human Rights Act in the last administration that has failed to be implemented effectively under the Moon administration.
Yeah. But regardless, we have to bring this up. How should the U.S. approach human rights in the negotiations process?
Well, one of the things that the U.S. has been willing to do is they call for complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program. And yet, why not also call for complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's political prison camp system? This may be too big of an ask to start with, but I think that one possibility would be to request access. North Korea said after Hanoi that they were worried about humanitarian conditions inside of the country. So why not have the U.S. and South Korea request access for the World Food Program or the International Committee of the Red Cross or UN agencies to have access to provide humanitarian assistance to North Koreans inside of those political prison camps? This would provide humanitarian assistance without violating North Korean sanctions. And it would be a way for us to raise some of our concerns about human rights issues and have a tangible deliverable at the end of the day. I think this would be one really critical ask, and I think it might even meet sort of Moon Jae-in's desire to see inter-Korean cooperation, because even maybe you could send in some aid workers from South Korea to provide direct assistance to those individuals. Mm-hmm.
We'll wrap up our segment here and move on to the photo of the week. This week, we have a picture of the North Korean couple getting married. If we look closer, we see that the bride and the groom are both wearing a badge of late leaders Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. What do you make of this photo?
Well, the badge itself, that is a symbol of the fact that every act in North Korean society is focused on reinforcing political loyalty to the Kim ruling family. And it even comes in very personal ways, like a wedding moment.
I mean, traditionally, when people get married, they go in a church setting, and the notion is that, they're recognizing before God and all of their closest friends that they're uniting in marriage. In this case, it makes clear that, all of the Kim leaders are viewed in a deity-like form. And we see that even in the wedding context, that they have to show allegiance to the entire Kim dynasty when they're having one of their most intimate moments and making one of their most important life decisions.
Mm-hmm. It definitely reinforces the Kim dynasty to all the North Koreans.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's it for this week's Washington Talk. Mr. Snyder, Ms. Enos, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Well, that's all for today's Washington Talk, and from all of us here at Voice of America, thank you for watching. This has been Connie Kim.